Welcome to Midway, one battle told day by day. It was June 4th, 1942. The number one song in America was Tangerine by Jimmy Dorsey Q. The Dow Jones closed that day at 102.57. A new home cost about $4,000. A new car cost about $1,000, and you could fill the tank on it at the cost of 20 cents per gallon on your way home from the grocery store, where you paid 9 cents for a loaf of bread. The New York Yankees played the Chicago White Sox that day, beating them 8-2, and the New York Giants, the baseball team, played the Chicago Cubs. The Cubs, of course, lost. There were about 2.3 billion people living on Earth. Virtually all of them were focused on the Second World War. Hitler had plunged the world into conflict a little less than 3 years earlier when German troops invaded Poland. But for the United States, participation in the war had begun only 7 months earlier, with the attack on Pearl Harbor. To get to the heart of the story, we contacted Mr. Bob Cressman at Naval History and Heritage Command. Let's tune in.
Are you aware of what the mood was in America, in the United States leading up to the battle?
Although, we'd been at war for, about 6 months. Things had not gone well. In April, we had the Doolittle raid, the Halsey Doolittle raid, where the strike on Japan was carried out by the Army Air Force bombers that were launched from the carrier Hornet, and that was more than a great morale builder, because it triggered something within the Japanese.
What was the world's view of the United States Navy leading up to the war?
Before the war, the U.S. Navy was looked at as quite powerful. It was principally based in the Pacific.
What was the Americans' perception of the United States Navy kind of going into this battle?
I think our Navy was sort of, you have to go back to the pre-war period when you see all these newsreels of lines of battleships and carriers launching airplanes and stuff like that. And before the war, the U.S. Navy was looked at as quite powerful.
What was the most important raid leading up to the Battle of Midway?
Operation where U.S. Navy carriers operated in concert against a single target was the Les Salamaua raid, 10 March 1942. Nobody ever talks about that one. It's, I think, the most important raid prior to Coral Sea, because you have two U.S. Navy carriers flying a strike of 104 aircraft against a Japanese amphibious force off these two ports on the coast of New Guinea, the opposite coast from Port Moresby, Lae and Salamaua, which the Japanese had just captured and were beginning to, build their bases there. And the American strike was flown over the mountains, which are very high. The Owen Stanley Mountains are very high and impassable most of the time. And on the way to carry out this strike, and as a part of the preparations, the Americans flew a couple of planes into Port Moresby and into another field to kind of get grasp on what it was like to fly there, who flew the routes, and what was the lay of the land as far as the flying over the mountains. And they discovered from these bush pilots and the men who'd flown these routes that the only time you could fly through the Owen Stanleys was for a very brief window of like maybe 2 hours in the middle of the day, because the mountains rise to peaks of like 12,000 feet. But there was one pass that you could fly through, and so they laid their plans to fly through this pass. 104 aircraft made the strike. Torpedo planes divided into two groups, part of the torpedo planes carrying torpedoes, half of bombs, all the dive bombers carrying bombs, and fighters with small bombs and their machine guns. And they totally surprised the Japanese and knocked around this amphibious force that had been conducting operations ever since the start of the war. So the Japanese were like operating on a shoestring by that point. They were using the same amphibious forces because the same ships turned up in these operations, Rabaul and New Guinea, and here they at the time didn't appreciate it that well. Admiral Nimitz said, probably, wouldn't stop the Japanese or wouldn't retard their advance. But Roosevelt actually had it right. And he called it the best day's work we've had, which is, a good title for a chapter, a book, or a book title. But
all right, well, that's all the time we have for this first segment of Battle of Midway, the podcast. Thank you for listening.